Assalamu alaikum. The topic for today is consumer surplus and producer surplus. So what is consumer surplus? Consumer surplus is the difference between the maximum willingness to pay and the actual that they have paid. Means वो ज़्यादा pay करना चाहते थे but they got the opportunity to pay less. तो कुछ जो amount वो pay नहीं किया उन्होंने, that is their surplus. How do we see that? How do we look at it? Let's look at it in form of numbers and through the graph. Now suppose at A, this, as we are talking about consumer surplus, we will talk about the demand curve because demand is always from consumer point of view. So this is the demand curve, and at A, this is the maximum willingness of consumer to pay, and this is the price which the consumer pays for this many number of units. So the area above the price and below the demand curve, area above the price and below the demand curve is called consumer surplus, and area below the price is actual expenditure, because expenditure is price multiplied by quantity. So this is the price and this is the quantity. Now if we want to calculate the consumer surplus, consumer surplus is the difference between the willingness to pay and the actual that they have paid. Normally willingness is greater and the actual that they have paid is smaller, but it differs. The cases differ because of elasticity of demand of that product or good or a service. So from this graph you can see the visual representation of consumer surplus and consumer expenditure. Moving forward, what can the consumer surplus change? Yes, it can change. But what are the factors that can lead to change in consumer surplus? There are two cases. Number one, the willingness to pay changes or the price changes. This is already drawn here, so I am going to draw a new diagram or a new graph so that you can see what is happening. This is price, this is quantity, and this is the demand curve. This is the maximum willingness of the consumer to pay, and this is the price. Suppose the price in the previous graph was 6. This is the price, and the area above the price and below the demand curve is the consumer surplus. But suppose the price changes. One scenario is that the price increases and becomes 8. The maximum willingness is 15. Now area above the price and below the demand curve is the consumer surplus, so we can visually see that this has reduced. And another scenario is that the price decreases. So when the price decreases, there is a possibility, not a possibility, when the price decreases, we can visually see that the area above the price and below the demand curve increases. So scenario number one is that price changes. When price changes, consumer surplus changes. And scenario number two is when the willingness of the consumer to pay changes. Initially the willingness of the consumer to pay was 15, but now willingness to pay becomes 20 and the price is, suppose, 6. The price is 6 and at one time the price is 8. Let's calculate. This is 8 and this is 6. So we said area above the demand, above the price and below the demand curve. So here 15, the difference between 8 and 15 is 7, and this is say 10, and this is say 20, right? 10 and 20. So this is 10. Half into 10 into 7 is equals to 35, right? And the same one here, the difference is 12 and the quantity is the quantity will have changed, because to move to 20, the demand curve would have gone up. The demand curve would have gone somewhere over here, so that it becomes 20. Even if it's a parallel shift in the demand curve, then obviously the quantity corresponding to this price 8 would be different. It wouldn't be 10. So we can see that the area as it is would be more. So another scenario, second scenario that we talked about is that the willingness to pay changes. Why does the willingness to pay change? That's a different story that depends upon elasticity of demand, availability of goods and services. When we talk about surplus, we need to understand two things. Number one, marginal consumer surplus, and the second one is total consumer surplus, or TCS, and surplus derived by consuming that particular unit. For example, if you are consuming 1 unit, then consumer surplus derived after consuming 1 unit. Then if you consume the second unit, surplus derived after consuming the second unit. Now, before we move on to calculation, let's understand what is marginal consumer surplus. Marginal means additional. Surplus derived after consuming an additional unit. And we need to understand that willingness to pay declines as you keep consuming more of a good. For example, glasses of juice. So if you are drinking first glass, if you're very thirsty, you will be willing to pay a higher price. Once your thirst is quenched, on the second glass, your willingness to pay will decline. आप 10 के बजाय $9 देना चाहेंगे. Similarly, on the third glass, the willingness further declines. On the fourth glass, it further declines. And there comes a time where willingness will be equal to the actual price. So this is a question similar to a question that came in the exam. This kind of question was part of the MCQs. So listen to me very carefully what the question is asking, or what we are about to answer. So this is a table where number of glasses of juice is given to us, and the willingness to pay for each glass is given to us. Actual stays the same for all because कीमत तो नहीं change होती है, ठीक है ना? So price stays the same. Now we have to calculate consumer surplus for each unit, right? Surplus for each unit. So consumer surplus is calculated by subtracting the actual from the willingness. Willingness minus actual. So here consumer surplus is 5. For the second one is 4, 3, 2, 1. And for the sixth glass, consumer surplus is 0. Now, if the question asks you what will be the impact on the total consumer surplus after consuming the sixth glass. Sixth glass means, are they talking about the total consumer surplus? No, they are talking about marginal consumer surplus. Marginal consumer surplus is the additional surplus. So what will be the impact on total consumer surplus after consuming the sixth glass? The answer is no impact, because the consumer surplus for the sixth glass is 0. So it does not change the value of total consumer surplus. Total consumer surplus कितना होगा? You add all these values to get the total consumer surplus of consuming 6 glasses. Now, how do we distinguish between marginal consumer surplus and the total consumer surplus? हमें कैसे पता चलेगा? If they say, what is the surplus after consuming the sixth glass? Means they are talking about marginal consumer surplus, and you will talk about the surplus derived after consuming the sixth glass, which is 0. What is the impact on total consumer surplus after consuming the fifth glass? Total consumer surplus changes by 1, right? But what is the total consumer surplus after, what is the surplus after consuming 5 glasses? It's the total of this. So how do we distinguish? When it says sixth unit, they're talking about marginal. When they say 6 units, then they are talking about total consumer surplus. Let's talk about producer surplus now that we have talked about consumer surplus. Producer surplus, as the name suggests, is going to be from producer point of view. So we will talk about supply curve. Producer surplus. We draw the supply curve. It begins from somewhere here on the price line or on the y-axis. It does not start from 0 because the producer is not going to be willing to take 0 amount initially also, right? So there is some willingness. This is the minimum willingness of the producer to receive. Why minimum? Because producer ko to jitna zyada milta jayega, they would be happy, right? So this is the minimum willingness of the consumer to accept the money in return of goods and services. So producer surplus is the area above the supply curve and below the price. So does producer surplus change? Yes, producer surplus also changes in the same 2 ways, whether the willingness to minimum willingness changes or the price changes. That is how producer surplus changes. Now we did see that the certain area in consumer surplus was expenditure, consumer expenditure. When we are looking at consumer surplus, the area below this rectangle or this square, whatever shape is formed, is the consumer expenditure. But what is this here for producer? And we can see that this is not even a rectangle or a square. This is a trapezium. Okay, this is a trapezium. So this is production cost for the producer. Okay, this is production cost for the producer. Why am I telling you this? Because if in exams you get a question, there is a question in the exam, I don't remember kaun se year ka tha wo, that was in the MCQs, that a graph was given to you or a diagram was given to you and they had asked you about production cost of the producer and the total revenue. If we talk about total revenue of the producer, what will be the total revenue? I said this is production cost, but what will be the revenue? Revenue is equals to price times quantity. So this is the price and this is the quantity. So this total, this entire rectangle becomes the revenue of the producers. Out of this revenue, this is production cost and this will be the producer surplus. Okay, so that is it for producer surplus and consumer surplus. I did explain how and why producer surplus and consumer surplus changes. Those were 2 cases.